Tonight, will it be deal or no deal? The countdown to Brexit is on.
The Article 50 process is now underway, and in accordance with the wishes of the British people, the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union.
Getting it right on trade, the biggest political test of Theresa May's life.
The British government faces what is arguably an unprecedentedly complicated task.
So what are the opportunities and what are the obstacles for Britain after Brexit?
Yes, things will change, trade deals will change, but that doesn't stop you from trading with the rest of the world.
Good evening and welcome to the Tonight programme. The White Cliffs of Dover, the global landmark from where Britain looks out to the world and to its closest neighbours in Europe, with whom we've traded freely for the past 40 years. But the historic vote to Brexit takes us out of that union and, the PM says, the single market. What we face now is the mammoth task of finding new ways of trading with the EU and the wider world beyond. Get it right and it could herald a new age of prosperity. Get it wrong and it could leave us all the poorer. As Britain counts down to Brexit, will it be deal or no deal? She's fired the starting gun on Article 50 and we're off. In 2 years we'll be out of the European Union and the clock is now ticking down to a new future for the UK.
This is an historic moment from which there can be no turning back.
As they battle to shape our post-Brexit destiny, for Theresa May and her government, the stakes could hardly be higher.
The next years are going to be quite staggeringly important because of the impact it'll have on almost everybody's lives in Britain.
It's a gargantuan task. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's going to take up all the resources of government over the next 2 years and possibly beyond.
Theresa May says she'll fight for the best possible trade deal for Britain. But outside of the single market, what will that mean?
Beyond Brexit, of course, it will change Britain's relationship with the rest of the world, because we'll be able to do trade deals which we couldn't do before.
The biggest test of Theresa May's political life starts here. Trade is vitally important to all of us. It's the lifeblood of our economy, creating jobs and building partnerships inside our borders and outside. It helps underpin key political relationships between Britain and the world. If trade flows smoothly, there are vast benefits which flow too.
We might be separated by the English Channel, but for the past 40 years we've been bound to our neighbours in Europe through trade, a single indivisible market and customs union which has allowed goods, services and workers to flow freely back and forth. But the historic decision to Brexit takes us out of that union and, the Prime Minister says, the single market. There will be, in her view, no half in, half out. Whatever the deal, it will fundamentally transform Britain's place in the world.
The government has said we won't be looking to copy the arrangements of other countries outside of the EU, like Norway and Switzerland. Instead, we'll be fighting for our own unique and comprehensive deal.
We seek a new and equal partnership between an independent, self-governing global Britain and our friends and allies in the EU.
But the EU has indicated we're not going to have our cake and eat it. And before we've even begun to talk trade, the EU has said there'll be a so-called divorce settlement, which some say could cost us up to £50 billion. And it's not the only immediate challenge.
The dilemma that Theresa May faces is she's talked about frictionless trade, but she wants us out of the customs union and the single market. Leaving both of those will give us more freedom in some ways. We can sign trade deals with other countries if we want to, but it will also almost certainly make it harder for us to trade with the EU.
So how are British businesses counting down to Brexit? Well, for some, there's no denying it could mean a disruption to trade. Exeter exports more than 70% of its goods and services to the EU, more than any other city in Britain. Tony Majewski has been making equipment for the oil industry for 25 years. Half of all the products he makes are sold to or go through the EU.
We were drilling a well in France 2 years ago, and we could ship all of the equipment there without having to pay duties. Somebody could just take it in the car, drive through the Channel Tunnel, and we could do that without any restriction, without having to answer to anybody.
For Tony, leaving the EU feels a risky business. If new rules of trade are established, he fears there could be customs checks on all his goods transported between Britain and the EU.
Customs is a very, very slow process. Even on a smaller scale, delays of 1 or 2 weeks just mean that business can't transact as efficiently as possible, and it means that those people that can trade without those restrictions are going to get more work simply because people want it now.
Whatever the potential obstacles of Brexit, some see leaving the single market and customs union as taking the shackles off. Currently, trade deals are struck on our behalf by the EU. After Brexit, we can strike deals on our own, something the PM is keen to trumpet.
I want us to be a truly global Britain, the best friend and neighbour to our European partners, but a country that reaches beyond the borders of Europe too.
It's an optimism which resonates in this Yorkshire business, which makes bendy plastic barriers. It's looking forward to pushing ever further out from the borders of the EU.
Currently, globally, we're about 250 people, and over the next 5 years, we expect that to grow to about 500.
I think the USA is going to be a great country for us to expand into. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India even, and we've even supplied China.
David Smith and son Luke are not worried about post-Brexit turbulence. Britain is already the 5th largest economy in the world, which should, they say, help us to absorb any shocks.
British engineering is the best in the world. We have a great product. Yes, things will change, trade deals will change, but that doesn't stop you from trading with the rest of the world.
But before we can even begin to strike global deals, there's a hard road of diplomacy ahead. Negotiations on a scale we've never experienced in our history, which have to be signed off by all the other 27 EU members. Britain's isolation in a club it's about to leave has, in recent months, been all too clear.
The problem the government faces is it's got an awful lot on its plate. They've got to get us out of the EU, they've got to negotiate a deal, they've got to negotiate a trade deal on top of the exit deal. They're going to start negotiating trade deals with other countries. So there's an awful lot of work to be done, and if you look at it that way, 2 years is a blink of an eye.
A critical part of the negotiation process will be how the PM and her government manages to protect key profitable British industries like car manufacturing or the financial services. But the EU has said an a la carte arrangement, being able to pick exactly what we want off the menu, isn't on the table.
Being a member of the European Union comes with rights and benefits. Cherry picking is not an option.
So we might just have to roll up our sleeves and be prepared to barter.
I mean, every negotiator going into negotiation has to determine what all their objectives are. And so you're looking to identify all of these issues and pick out the ones that are the peaks and the troughs in terms of value and ease of giving away. And that's how you do deals in negotiation, is by taking the same item and one side giving it to the other. And when you've got several of those, of course, you package them together, you make deals.
Some industries in Britain are already worried they could lose out. In West Wales, it's lambing season.
We're in the middle of lambing here, and it's the most exciting time, I think. It's great, you know, bringing new life into the world.
Richard Tudor farms at Aberystwyth. He exports half his stock here to the EU and the rest to major British supermarkets. The EU single market protects Richard's lamb from competition from cheap foreign imports. But when we leave the single market, new trade deals with big farming countries like New Zealand could turn up the heat on our own industry. Cheap meat for us, tough competition for Richard.
Striking a deal with New Zealand, if it's not done properly, it would finish the Welsh sheep industry, there's no doubt about it, because the climate that they've got, they don't have the winter, therefore we just can't compete on price with them.
It may be an iconic industry in Wales and the backbone of the rural economy, but in comparison to other British sectors in terms of how much tax it generates for the government, it is undeniably small, something of which Richard is acutely aware.
I'm worried that they might use us as a bargaining chip, as a pawn really. They'll want to sell their financial services across the world and will just allow other countries to put a tariff on our lambs when they're exported.
In the countdown to Brexit, every industry in the country will be bidding for the best possible deal with Europe. The challenge is to convince those in power of just how important they are to the British economy. Simon Black is the boss of an e-payments company called PPRO in the financial services industry.
I'm heading off to Luxembourg, where we've opened a new office recently, so we're potentially going to have to move our headquarters there as a result of Brexit.
Britain is the largest exporter of financial services in the single market. It accounts for nearly 8% of our GDP and provides thousands of jobs. It's a sector 11 times the size of farming. But Brexit has given businesses like Simon's pause for thought.
Before Brexit, we had a very clear plan where we know that within the next 5 years, we'd go from having 20 employees in London to at least 200. Now, with Brexit, we've got to shift our focus, create an operation in Luxembourg, and likely we'll get to a maximum 40 or 50 in London and have at least 100 people in the same period in Luxembourg.
The fear is that when leaving the single market, British businesses like Simon's will automatically lose access to the EU's financial passporting system. So how does that work at the moment?
The passporting system, to simplify tremendously, is a system that allows financial institutions to trade across the EU as if they were trading in one country. So they don't have to worry about different rules and regulations. It makes it a lot easier to trade across borders. If we lose that, some of these financial services firms will not be able to trade across Europe as easily as they can now from here.
Relocating to Luxembourg means businesses like Simon's can retain access to this privilege. The government has said it wants London to remain the leading financial centre of Europe, and protecting that status appears to be a priority. There is talk of creating an equivalent to passporting if negotiations don't work out. But in reality, this could prove difficult, something of great concern to Simon.
If at the end of the Brexit negotiation passporting does not continue, there'll be a direct negative impact. Thousands of jobs will be moved out of the UK, and there'll be a huge negative reduction in our economic growth.
There are other factors forming a backdrop to our negotiations. There are potential trade deals to be won outside of the EU, not least with the new man in the White House.
Today, the United States renews our deep bond with Britain. We have one of the great bonds.
I think that the evidence today that actually Trump wants to do some sort of trade deal is because of what he said.
Madam Prime Minister, we look forward to working closely with you as we strengthen our mutual ties in commerce, business, and foreign affairs.
He made some very, very nice noises about this country. And, of course, his mother was Scottish, and that seems to matter to him. So he's obviously an Anglophile.
The prospects of a deal with Trump might give us added confidence in our Brexit talks, but at the moment we're only talking prospects. Given we currently sell much more to America than they sell to us, he may seek to change that balance in America's favour.
His rhetoric is exports good, imports bad. Now, we sell them more stuff than we buy from them, so we're starting in a position where he might think that's unfair. So a lot is going to depend on personal relationships between the President and the United Kingdom in general, and I think Mrs May in particular.
I feel that if there is some sort of deal where perhaps the US might benefit more from it than the UK, I wouldn't just dismiss that out of hand, provided it benefited the UK. And if that would be the case, I'd still sign up to it. And who knows, you might have another treaty down the road which benefits us more.
A strong relationship with America, and indeed with other big nations outside the EU, might strengthen our hand in Brussels. But Theresa May still has to achieve agreement with all 27 EU member states. They've pledged to speak with one voice, but history tells us it may not be that simple. In October last year, a massive trade arrangement between Canada and the EU was almost railroaded after 7 years of talks by a tiny province in Belgium called Wallonia. Farmers here feared being squeezed out by cheap Canadian imports. They stood their ground and managed to stall the deal. Luc Hollande is a farmer living on the border of Flanders and Wallonia. He campaigned to halt the deal.
For us, it was a moment of intense joy. We managed to make our voices heard. It was a really exceptional moment.
Ministers in Canada said that a deal with the EU was simply unworkable after it was blocked. In the end, it went through, but it underlined how difficult it could be for Britain when so many voices are competing to be heard.
Great Britain has a lot to worry about because they see what it takes to make a treaty and the pressure to have it passed. We're in a globalised system where the fittest survive and, to be frank, the weakest is left to die.
So a testing time ahead for negotiations on the continent, but what about in Theresa May's own backyard? Arguably the biggest test she faces is how Brexit will impact the union of the United Kingdom itself. This is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the UK's only land border with the EU. It's open, free and flowing, not only vital for trade, but testament to the historic political settlement which brought about peace. A border here and all the memories it might revive would be politically unacceptable for many. While Theresa May has said she's aiming for a seamless, frictionless border, there has to be a border somewhere, somehow.
Of the options available, one lies out here in the Irish Sea, which could form a watery border between the island of Ireland and Great Britain. It would mean that goods coming out of Northern Ireland and the Republic would get their customs checks on the British mainland, either at airports or seaports, or even here in Belfast itself. But some businesses in Northern Ireland fear that could entangle them in bureaucracy and could even hinder the flow of trade in the United Kingdom itself.
Cormac Diamond is one Northern Irish businessman who fears customs checks on the Irish Sea would slow down his business. He sells bespoke blinds from a factory west of Belfast. It's a next-day service and 60% of his customers are on the UK mainland.
Our key selling point as a business is speed from the point of ordering to the point where a customer receives the product. An example of that, for instance, is if a customer in London was to order a blind, they can order that product up to 4:30 in the evening and it'll be produced by 5:30 and they will receive it the next day. And for us to have that restricted in any way, it'll jeopardise our business.
But the hard border alternative could be worse and stir lingering sectarian tensions.
What would it mean for you personally to see potentially a border put up again between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
Well, it's difficult because we were part of the generation that was moving beyond, you know, the idea of borders or the idea of religion being the main driver of how you live your day-to-day life. So the reinstallation of a border for us is challenging because it's a mental move back into the past, and it's back where people don't want to be.
Ultimately, the EU might permit a special deal on Northern Ireland's border, given how much it too has invested in the peace process. But it could then create big problems elsewhere. Nicola Sturgeon has already thrown down the gauntlet, calling for a second independence referendum for Scotland, given the majority there voted to stay in the EU. For her, a special deal open border for Northern Ireland would be unfair to Scottish businesses.
I'm not suggesting for a second that Scotland is the same as Ireland in terms of the history, but I'm making the point that it is simply not credible for a Prime Minister, I think I'm almost directly quoting her here, to go to the Republic of Ireland and say there will be no hard border, there will be no barriers to trade between Ireland and the UK post-Brexit, and to come to Scotland and say something different. It is not credible, and it runs the risk of treating people as if we're stupid.
Nicola Sturgeon's push for a second independence referendum and the precise timing of it will without doubt be one of the most pressing issues in Mrs May's in-tray. Despite all these challenges, the government is confident that a good deal will be struck with our European neighbours. And even if there's no deal, the thought of which horrifies some, the government claims it wouldn't be a disaster.
While I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain.
But if there is no agreement, we would fall back on World Trade Organization or WTO rules for trade. That would mean tariffs for businesses on imports and exports at levels already set by the WTO. It would add costs to doing trade, and some of them would be significant.
WTO rules mean that tariffs have to be applied. It's not a question of whether we choose, but the WTO stipulates tariff levels. So unless we get an agreement with the EU to reduce tariffs, we will have to apply tariffs on their goods, they will have to apply tariffs on our goods, which means that our exports are more expensive and our imports from the EU are more expensive.
But the government is adamant this wouldn't be the end of the world. In fact, for many British businesses, the fall in the pound post the Brexit vote has already boosted their exports. Our Yorkshire business says that might ultimately balance out any potential tariffs.
Any changes in tariffs that are brought into the UK will be more than made up for in the exchange rate shift that we've currently had. Hopefully the government will step in and offer some rebates against the tariffs that are there, but we will see. Only time will tell.
The battle for Brexit is now truly underway, the biggest political challenge we've faced since the war. Whether it's deal or no deal, what unfolds in the next 2 years will shape our country's future for generations to come. The world is watching. And European leaders are continuing to discuss their strategies for striking a new deal with Britain. And of course, our colleagues at ITV News will follow every twist and turn of that story. If you'd like more information on tonight's programme, please visit our website at itv.com/tonight.